Public-Private Partnership Steering Committee. We do have several agenda items this morning. The bulk of those are focused on the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. I do want to note at the outset for members of the public who may be in attendance, there is a potential for us to go into closed meeting if members of the committee wish to discuss any of the financing assumptions in detail related to the DBFOM model. That would be under the provisions of the code that allow us to go into closed session to discuss specifics of a business deal that may impact our negotiating position in the future. That is not a sure thing. That will be up to members of the committee as to whether or not we do that, but I did want to make members of the public aware of that potential as we convene this meeting today. You do have a copy of the agenda in front of you. We're going to be starting with an overview of the changes to the PPTA legislation. That incorrectly lists me. Secretary Lane is actually going to be going through those changes. He will then be taking off, and then Morteza Farjan is going to walk through the changes to the P3 guidelines that the Commonwealth Transportation Board adopted 2 months ago in response to those legislative changes, and that will be followed by a briefing by Commissioner Kilpatrick, who will be walking through the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel public sector analysis and competition as he discusses the process the department would like to undertake to initiate a P3 procurement for that project. Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I did notice there's a little difference in the makeup of the board here, and so I know that's a result of some changes on the Commonwealth Transportation Board and representatives, and so welcome John Malbin here. I appointed him because Mr. Fralin had rotated off the board, and so John was the pick. Part of that was because this project we're going to be talking about, the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, it's going to be in his area, and some big decisions, I think, for the department and also for you guys to consider. But just a little bit about where we've been. As you know, last session we built on the earlier reforms in the P3 process from the 2015 legislation that had first established this committee and codify the additional administrative reforms to be used in a P3 procurement, and of course, specifically on Interstate 66, P3. And I think we can all agree that that was a success for the Commonwealth, at least in terms of our negotiations, and that resulted in a $579 million check being received by the Commonwealth, and that's actually in the bank, which is even better in that. So. This legislation was bipartisan, but it was carried by Delegate Jones and Senator Carrico, and it established some key parameters. First, that it established a parameter that when a P3 may be in the best interest of the public, not just in a public interest, but had to be in the best interest. A lower public contribution, significant transportation benefits, and risk transfer to the private sector had to be present. It changed the name of this committee from advisory to steering. Now the Transportation Public-Private Partnership Steering Committee, because you don't normally, you just advise, you actually make decisions and help steer this process. And now you also have two formal roles in the P3 process. It's first reviewing the public sector analysis to determine whether the assumptions are fair and appropriate. Remember, we now have to make sure that we identify what the public sector can do it for, and only if the private sector can meet or exceed those parameters would a P3 be considered. So we had to make sure that that's a fair comparison. We weren't looking to try to stymie private input, but on the other hand, we wanted to make sure there was a very realistic goal and that we could actually procure this under the state terms if we couldn't find private sector. So your involvement in that is key. This step is prior to the initiation of a procurement by VDOT or DRPT. The second thing that we did is after the request for qualifications is issued, VDOT or DRPT, whoever the procuring agency is, must come back to the committee with a finding of public interest. So that's when we come back and say, we said we thought this was in our interest, and now we come back to you and say it is, and here are the reasons why. And you then must concur with the findings through a majority vote for the agency to issue the request for proposals. So you play a very important role in safeguard. Now today we're here about the first meeting, the first one we're advising you, to discuss a proposed path forward. and that is in regards to the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. Now, this is different than a typical project that we would normally advance under a PPTA. Now, why is that? Because we are not in this particular case hoping to combine toll financing for this project with construction. In other words, remember on 66, it was financed primarily by tolls. We had thought originally it was going to take a public subsidy. As it turned out, it did not. But it was tolls. Here, Hampton Roads is a little bit different. We are building the hot lanes network down in Hampton Roads. And as we do it, they're incremental pieces. Well, those incremental pieces are not as valuable as what the whole network will generate when it's actually built out, where instead of going 4 or 5 miles at a time, eventually you may have 25 to 30 miles of a hot lanes network. So what we would hope to do is once we got these projects built, and remember, besides the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, there are projects on the high-rise bridge, for instance, that's going to have a hot lanes. But again, that was not sold. It was done as a design build. So the key here is we're building this network, and we hope one day to then monetize on behalf of the state to be used for projects in Hampton Roads, that hot lanes network, but only after it's built. So it's a little different than what we did on 66, where we were doing 22 miles, and the project on its own made sense to procure, combining that toll revenue with financing the project. In fact, most of this project is going to be financed through Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission regional monies. That's the majority of what's going to finance this project. Now, so what we want to do here, though, is to compete various construction concepts for building a new tunnel. And this is really the key when you hear Mr. Kilpatrick get up and talk a little bit later on why we're going to recommend we do a public-private partnership or a P3 procurement, although we will not be looking to attract private sector monies at this time. And it's because of this bored versus the submerged tunnel to increase competition. Under our design build laws, we're pretty good at, we've done the immersed tunnels before. Not so much under the bored tunnel concept. And this is, quite frankly, very comparable to what happened at the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, where they did use the public-private or the P3 procurement, even though they did not seek financing or private sector equity, but they did look to pass on risks related to the construction that we can't necessarily get in our design build under this, and that's why we're going to come to you and talk to you about this project, and Mr. Kilpatrick, as I said, will go through in more detail. Now, again, the Virginia Public Procurement Act does not contain enough flexibility in our opinion, and I concur with the department, to allow for this type of flexibility to pass on additional risk. And let's take, for instance, geotechnical risk. We're boring underneath a seabed instead of digging it out, so hopefully it doesn't collapse. And I'm not suggesting it will, but I'm saying those are different types of risks that we would like to pass on. Our Procurement Act doesn't allow us to necessarily address those specifically. So I wanted to point that out to you, and we wanted to get your concurrence that you agree with this. Quite frankly, it may not be needed, but that's not the purpose of this committee. We want to make sure you're in agreement and understand why we're procuring, because this will be in the billions of dollars in what we're trying to do in the future. So, Mr. Chairman, that's a brief history of where the act was, how we used it before, and how we plan to use it in the future. And again, it is passing on risk to the private sector. We believe it's in the public's best interest to do this, and therefore we're seeking your approval as we go down this path. But we will not be looking to put out a proposal for attracting tolling dollars. It will be a toll facility, and VDOT will manage that facility working with the Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission, the TPO, and those monies will go to help support the project and put other projects down there. And eventually we hope to time in with these other projects here in a few years and monetize that network much like we did on 66 and 95 in Northern Virginia. So I'll turn it over before to Mr. Morteza, but before I do that, is there any questions of the committee in general terms and why we're choosing to bring this to your attention? Yes.
What you're saying would be equivalent to what we allow, say, our universities to do construction management at risk, the CM at risk projects.
That is correct.
Right. Where, I mean, we may be financing it with bonds, state
right.
bonds, but they choose that pathway where that contractor, soup to nuts, is responsible for everything and the risk.
That's right. In other words, if we looked at our design bill or for the Procurement Act, we believe there's risks that we could pass on that are not defined in that would be able to be passed on if we were in a P3 procurement. And remember, that act is not just about financing. It's about can we pass on risks that are in the public's best interest. But yes, Rob, that's pretty close to what we're saying here.
And Mr. Vaughn, there are also some other issues that the commissioner is going to get into when he speaks later related to greater levels of competition by competing both bored and submerged tunnels, which would be difficult under the Procurement Act. But again, the commissioner will get into that in more details during his presentation.
Yeah, I think this is an evolution of continuing. VDOT has really been seen as the leader in their design build. It's continuing the evolution of attracting private ingenuity innovations where we didn't have those flexibilities before. Now, you might ask, do we see us doing this a lot in the future? I don't think so, because I think the Public Procurement Act, the design bill covers most things, but this is so unusual because of the bored tunnel and the risks that typically are not present when dealing with a normal construction project in the Commonwealth.
Mr. Secretary, just to be clear, has the decision been made to go with a bored tunnel over the cut and cover tunnel, or is that still part of the decision?
That is part. That the decision has not been made, and under the Procurement Act, we think we'd have to make a decision. And this, using the P3, we're not making that decision, and that increases competition because, and we hope will lower costs to the Commonwealth. And that was the experience of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel that Mr. Malbin participated in that procurement.
And Secretary Lane, if I recall correctly, the way the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel did their procurement, they had 3 respondents. 2 were going to submerge the tunnel and 1 was going to board, or I may have switched that. But what we got was a greater level of participation by the contractors because some specialize in bored tunnels, some specialize in submerged, and simply put, under the existing Procurement Act, we think we'd have to select one to get the 30% plans, and we think that would keep certain people out of the procurement process.
Yeah, so Mr. That has not been selected, and I applaud VDOT for taking this innovative approach to say, you know, we've come a long way from saying here's what we want to saying what we really want is a hole in the water. You guys tell us how's the best way to get there, and use their ingenuity combined with VDOT's experience in managing these contracts. Okay, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I hope I should mention this probably is the last time, although you never know with Governor McCullough, we do have 40 days left, but probably the last time that I'll address this committee. But I want to say thank you for the work that you do. I think this committee has made the transparency, but also the delivery of project and our citizens much, much better. And I appreciate the work you do, and I've enjoyed working with you. And hopefully these are type of reforms and continuances with the new administration under Governor-elect Northam. We continue on some of the things that have been started, but I want to appreciate your help and willing to serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Next, we have Morteza Ferjian, who's going to walk through a quick update to the P3 guidelines that were adopted by the Commonwealth Transportation Board at their meeting 2 months ago. Mr. Ferjian?
Before you start,
yes.
Can we request copies of those guidelines and provide
yeah.
to the members?
Yes. And we will post those online, but also if we can have hard copies delivered to Mr. Vaughn and Mr. Powell, Morteza, we'd really appreciate that.
Sure, we'll make you hard copies. The electronic versions are also available on our website, but we'll make copies for you and give them to you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I want to follow what Mr. Secretary was discussing a little bit earlier about the changes that we had in the legislation, PPTA legislation in 2017. This is the first time that this committee is meeting after those changes. Mr. Secretary mentioned very high level a couple of those changes. Basically, we have now a mandate to develop public sector analysis and competition. What it means is that we need to go back and analyze the project that we want to procure and understand how public can build a project on its own, how we can finance it, what's the cost to us. As part of that process, we need to establish a maximum public contribution before procurement begins. That's mainly useful if we have a design, build, finance, operate, maintain type of procurement, especially like the one that we had for 66. If you all remember, as part of that procurement, we established $600 million as the cap for private sector. We told them that we can build a project at $600 million and we will only entertain the proposals if the proposal comes under $600 million.
And Mr., if I could just note, as the Secretary noted, many of the changes that were made during the 2017 session were related to toll concessions and really competing whether we're publicly or privately financing a project. I do think the project before us today is slightly different, and so we are going to show you when the Commissioner speaks, and Mr. Farrakhan is going to go through this now, several different steps that in a toll finance project would have I think a greater degree of relevance to the discussion we're going to have today. We have completed those for today, and he is going to discuss them as well. But again, in this project, because we're not debating whether to publicly or privately finance it, some of the things may seem slightly out of step with some of the things the Commissioner is going to talk about later. So I did just want to note that, again, as the Secretary said, this is a unique project that I don't anticipate we'll see many of coming before the committee. So I would just ask that the members keep that in mind as Mr. Farrakhan goes through these updated steps.
Really, one of the outcomes of the new changes is that when we start the process, that I will explain to you what it is a little bit later, we don't really know what the final product is going to be. As we go through the process and we analyze the project, we can go either way. In 66, DBFOM looked to be better. For this project, Commissioner is going to walk you through his finding, but now we have a different outcome because the two projects are different. And really, the other element of the legislation that was changed is creation of this committee. Now we have it in the code. Before we had it in a different capacity in our guidelines or in the code, but now there is a new role defined for you. I will explain what the role is and at what level, at what points during the process you will get involved and what will be your involvement in the next slides. And then the other step is that, as Mr. Secretary mentioned, Commissioner needs to make a finding of public interest. That's what's best in public's interest. And then Secretary, in his role as Chairman of CTB, needs to concur with that finding. It's a little bit difficult to see all the steps in this slide. In the next few slides, we are going to zoom in and show you the different steps. But at very high level, I want to share with you that our new manual has basically 3 different phases for project development and procurement. Phase 1, which is really the beginning of the process for us, is called the screening phase. That's when we start at very high level looking at the numbers, mainly numbers that we get from our environmental study, look at different ideas and try to figure out what makes sense. Phase 2 is project development, and phase 3 is our procurement. You see that in phase 1, there are a couple of high-level information that we put together, and we provide a report to Commissioner. If he's comfortable with the findings, we go to phase 2, and that's really where we are now. That's the phase that we develop a little bit more information. We have had a risk workshop for this project, for example. We have used the results of that risk workshop to better refine our analysis. And we have developed a private sector option, which is the HR tag option. We have developed a publicly financed option, design, build, finance, operate, maintain. We have provided the report that compares the 2 options to you, and we can discuss it in more detail later. But really, where we are now is a decision that you need to make in terms of whether the assumptions we have made in that analysis, whether the analysis that we have developed is sufficient enough to move forward to the next level, which is procurement. When procurement starts for this project, we're going to issue a request for qualifications with a term sheet that would talk at very high level about risk allocations, how it's going to look like in the procurement. There are several steps in that slide that we will not follow for this project. That's what Mr. Chairman was mentioning a little bit earlier. We have those steps for a project that has a design, build, finance, operate, and maintain element in it. For this particular project, because we are not getting any proposals for design, build, finance, operate, maintain, it's much simpler than what you see in that slide. We will just shortlist teams, and then we would, based on this, we would issue a request for proposal to the shortlisted teams. But throughout that process, you see that you will have another role when we get the responses from proposers in terms of statement of qualifications. Before we go to a request for proposal stage in the code, we have a requirement, which is basically you need to meet again. That's going to be the second meeting that you all would meet. And we will seek an action from you at that stage to confirm that moving forward with this project under Public-Private Transportation Act is in public interest.
And I would just like to note, Mr. Vaughn and Mr. Casper were here under the 66 process. Mr. Malvin, Mr. Powell, you were not. The way the law was structured previously is this committee acted before we had any indication from the private sector as to whether or not they thought they could actually meet or exceed our terms. Some of the committee members, under the previous structure, said they felt that was slightly out of order, and so administratively and voluntarily, we held an additional meeting of this committee after we had received responses on 66 to be able to have some of those discussions and provide assurances to members of the committee. We thought that was an appropriate thing that shouldn't be voluntary in the future based on the predilections or whims of future administrations, and so now the law would require that second check-in with this committee once we have kind of responses from the private sector regarding whether, from a financial perspective, they can meet or exceed our terms. Again, for the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, as Mr. Faraghian noted, we are not going to have those steps because we are not soliciting that information. We are still going to come back to this committee, though, once we have shortlisted proposers, and we'll kind of, let you know who's looking at, board versus immersed and other types of pertinent details that are related to why we're asking to proceed with this under the PPTA. But I did just want to note, we thought the comments raised by the committee back in 2016 related to I-66 made a lot of sense, or excuse me, 2015, and we did update the legislation to really take into account some of those comments that were raised by the committee members so that you are being asked to make decisions at times where we have the type of information that you think is necessary to allow you to make an informed decision on whether we proceed.
Then there are a couple of other checks and balances. After we get proposals, we still have an audit that's in the legislation. We need to do it. Commissioner needs to, we need to update our public sector option analysis again, present it to Commissioner, and he needs to look at his finding of public interest and make sure that that's still valid and send a letter to Governor at that stage. So you see that there are multiple checks and balances in the process. This is really the first one, but there are many more to come. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have about the process. Otherwise, Commissioner can walk you through the details of this project.
Are there any questions for Mr. Faraghian?
VDOT is advertising the project.
Can you have your green button, Jason, so they can hear you? Or Mr. Powell, excuse me. The question was, will VDOT be the procuring agency for the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel? I think the Commissioner will be getting to that, but I'm seeing folks nod their head yes. All right, thank you. Commissioner Kilpatrick, you're up.
Good morning. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to walk you through what I'll call the project that's before you today, which is the expansion of the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel and the approach roadways. And then at the end of the presentation, I want to talk about an opportunity for a broader express lane network. I'll start out with saying that from my position, I believe it is in the public's interest to proceed forward with the procurement under the PPTA, the Public-Private Transportation Act, with a design, build, delivery method. And I'll walk you through why I believe that's in the public interest. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the history and the progress to date regarding this particular project. And I will get into a little bit of detail. This really is not a technical presentation, but I'd be glad to dive in as deep as you want to go in terms of some of the technical aspects, because it is really an incredible project and opportunity here. Back in December of 2016, about a year ago, the board issued a resolution endorsing what's called Alternative A as the Hampton Roads Crossing Study's preferred alternative. And I'm going to talk just in a minute what that really means. We've conducted, in the spring of this year, we conducted a bunch of industry forums, both large scale, where we had several hundred people in attendance, and then individual meetings with potential teams, really wanting to understand their approach to a project like this. And again, we did continued on with risk workshops, analyzing the alternatives and opportunities for the project. And in June of this year, Federal Highway issued their record of decision. So on federal projects, on projects of this sort of magnitude, under NEPA, National Environmental Protection Act, they're required to, the federal agency makes a record of decision and decides the alternative that is acceptable and in compliance with NEPA. And so that was done in June. So what that approval was for 6 lanes of roadway on both the Hampton side and the Norfolk side from 564 there at Norfolk, where it splits off to the naval base on the Norfolk side, up through Settlers Landing, which is where the 6-lane interstate now narrows to 4 lanes, and then a 3-lane tube under Hampton Roads, under the water. So that was what was approved as the record of decision. And again, the basis of that was some of the other constraints that were part of that decision were significant limitations on right-of-way impacts on both the Norfolk side and the Hampton side, that fundamentally we needed to build these improvements within the existing rights-of-way of I-64. So that was a constraint that, that did limit us in terms of what could or could not be built. And frankly, the other was to the extent that a project would be fundable, was a part of that analysis. So that was a project that was approved by Federal Highway, and that was alternative A that was listed, that the board heard in December of last year. So in July of this year, the board also was briefed on the potential of including this project in a broader express lanes network. And again, I'm going to talk about that at the end. And then finally, the HRTPO voted to include the project in the this project in the express lanes network. So I want to talk a little bit now about the project itself. So the scope of this procurement is proposed to be I-64 from the 664 interchange there at Hampton Coliseum down to the interchange at 564 in Norfolk. So it's about 12 miles long, including the improvements of the roadway as well as the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. And the final configuration that we are driving towards would be up to 2 express lanes and 2 general purpose lanes in each direction. So I want to talk a little bit about that. As we started to analyze both the limitations in right-of-way and the configuration of the roadway, and also these meetings with with interested teams, we really began to recognize that in order to maximize the efficiency of this facility, a 4-lane tunnel, not a 3-lane, was a better solution, and one that we thought was very important to the success of this project. And the basis for that really is, as you start to analyze the various configurations and peak traffic flows, and how would you reverse traffic in a 3-lane tube, and all of these types of things, we just recognized that really what we needed to do is to get 4 lanes in each direction under Hampton Roads. We also realized that we were, with the constraints of the right-of-way on the Hampton and the Norfolk side, the ability to build a full 8-lane interstate on both approaches would be very difficult without significant costs, elevated structures, and impacts that we had committed not to take. So again, with those sort of constraints in mind, we began to develop the project scope in a way that you would have 2 lanes general purpose in each direction, eastbound and westbound at all times. And you would have 2 lanes of express lane in each direction through the tunnel and the trestle over water at all times. On the land side, both north or east and west, you would have one express lane in each direction at all times. Again, 2+1. We are continuing to look at the opportunity to expand the inside shoulder of 64 on the land side that could allow us to run two express lanes in the peak period using what we call hard running shoulder. We're still evaluating that. There are costs involved there, and ultimately some of these features that we consider as part of this project may be limited by the available dollars. And so as we go through this procurement, the procurement will be set up in a way that we ensure that we can deliver the base scope, but also looking at opportunities for what we believe is the preferred scope of this project, which in the end would be 3 lanes in each direction. I'll call it 2+1, one being an express lane, +1, which is the hard running shoulder for 2 express lanes in the peak direction. So that's sort of the basis of what we've been looking at. As part of that project, we are looking at the existing Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, specifically the westbound tube. The westbound tube is the original tunnel. It has a vertical constraint that is very problematic in Hampton Roads. We routinely are stopping a dozen or more trucks a day approaching the westbound tunnel because they are hitting our overheight detectors. We've done some things with advanced detectors, and we're working with Old Dominion and others and trying to better understand what's going on. But regardless, we have an overheight issue. So that is one of the components we are looking to consider as part of the project, are various opportunities for improving the overheight issue in the westbound tunnel. The eastbound tunnel, frankly, does not have those issues. It's rare for us to have an overheight issue in the eastbound tunnel. So again, that's another component of this project. In terms of, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about the procurement process itself here in a minute. So if I can go to some of the project benefits, and again, these are expectations under the PPTA. Person throughput, as I mentioned, the project will include 2 lanes general purpose in each direction, and at least 1 express lane in each direction over the entire length, and 2 express lanes underwater and over water. Congestion mitigation, that's sort of straightforward. This is the most significant choke point in Eastern Virginia. There is no other facility, no other spot in Eastern Virginia that you have these constraints and these limitations and the sensitivity and the sort of the fragile nature of the network caused by this crossing. Safety, it is one of the 7 kind of choke points around Hampton Roads. It's a primary evacuation route out of Norfolk in Virginia Beach during emergencies and such as hurricanes and other large storms. Economic development, I know many of you are very familiar with the Port of Virginia and the expansion of the Port of Virginia and the other activities that are going on in Hampton Roads. And these facilities, these water crossings specifically, are choke points that challenge economic vitality in this region. In terms of environmental quality, as I mentioned during the NEPA process, the commitments regarding limiting the impact to communities, to Hampton University, to Willoughby Spit, and to the naval facility there on the south side. All of those things were constraints. The construction of this facility, again, largely will be within the right-of-way and or over and underwater. And we'll go through those processes looking at aquatic life and those as we go through the project evaluation. It's not expected to change land use in terms of the broader comprehensive plan for the region, but back to the economic development, we see it as a clear improvement to the opportunities in Hampton Roads. The procurement status, we looked at delivery of this in really 2 forms. One is a design build, and the other is design, build, finance, operate, and maintain. And so a lot of times people describe the second DBFOM as a concession. And an example of that is I-66 outside the Beltway, the express lanes on on 95 are another example. The downtown and midtown tunnel project are fundamentally a DBFOM. Design build, the Public Procurement Act allows for us to do design build, and I'm going to talk in more detail about this in a minute, but our design build process is allowed under both the Procurement Act and under the PPTA, and I'll walk you through why I believe that the PPTA is the right code reference and process to go through regarding this. So why did we, so as we went through the public sector and analysis, we identified the design build as a better option under than the DBFOM. And a couple of fundamental reasons. The DBFOM, the revenue generated by this facility was a fraction of the total cost of the project. And it just, if you look at it, and if we go to the, I'm going to go to this slide here, which fundamentally the revenue, the toll revenue that was expected to come off of this project was only a small portion of the cost of the project in terms of, and Morteza, help me find the toll revenue on this chart.
Well, Commissioner, if I'm reading this table correctly, it shows that in the most, what appears to be aggressive scenario, only $354 million
That's right.
debt and equity would be able to be supported by tolls, which for a total project cost looks to be about 10%. On 66, like what is our debt and equity percentage with regard to like total cost?
That's more than total cost.
Okay, so we'd be going from 100+% to 10% if we were to move forward with a toll concession on this particular project.
And that fundamentally is the first. So do you concession off an asset when the concessionaire is only basically putting 10% in, and the public is putting 90% of the project cost in? You know, in terms of transfer of operating risk, if we were a state that had no experience operating underwater tunnels, then you might say, well, gosh, that's a risk that the Commonwealth doesn't want to engage in. But we've been operating these underwater tunnels in Hampton roads for 50, 60 years. And so we know how to do this. It's not unusual for us. It's not that we're not transferring this unknown risk of how do you operate a tunnel facility, because frankly, we know how to do that. So that's a fundamental point in terms of, I'll use the term as out of whack. When you're going to put 90% public funds and only 10% private, you're not going to concession off your asset.
Commissioner, I believe Mr. Powell has a question.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Commissioner, what is the term that you're using when you calculate the lifetime O&M cost and your revenue horizon? It's not on the chart anywhere?
Yeah, it was 50 years. So what we were doing is and that's sort of Mr. Powell, sort of a baseline that we've been using is kind of a 50-year. As we've talked with concessionaires around on other projects, that seems to be kind of the range that these concessions are settling on.
Well, and Commissioner, if I said to Mr. Powell, to your point, I think you'll almost always see us use 50 years if there's any type of toll financing. On 66, we tried to look at a term of 40 years because we can't really sell 9C debt beyond 39 years. The Treasury Department is not particularly keen on debt longer than that lifetime. However, the TIFIA loans from the United States Department of Transportation offer extremely flexible terms that make a lot of these projects work. They've really structured their financing terms to deal with the ramp-up period and other risks that toll roads in particular have, whether they're publicly or privately financed. And the TIFIA office told us in very direct terms that they would not like a term of 40 years and that they'd like to see a tail of 5 to 10 years on top of that. They indicated 50 would be their kind of ideal type of term. So I don't think you'll ever see us come forward with terms beyond 50 years in the future. Similarly, I don't think you'll, unless they change the TIFIA program, see us come forward with terms shorter than 50 years.
And so in terms of this, why again we don't believe the DBFOM the path to take on this particular project. We ran analysis even under the most optimistic revenue conditions. We still could not get a revenue stream that really changed the balance of the public contribution versus what a concessionaire would be willing to put at risk on a project. And fundamentally, we are both the position of Governor McAuliffe and frankly by code now that we would not hard toll one of these existing crossings. In other words, we wouldn't toll all lanes all the way across. Examples of that are Fort McHenry Tunnel up in Baltimore, the Holland and the Lincoln tunnels in New York City. All the bridge crossings in New York are hard tolled all the way across. But again, both by policy and now by code, we are not hard tolling this facility. And so you're only tolling the additional capacity, and we're only tolling what would be non-HOV capacity at this facility. So again, that's where we got to this point and said it just does not make sense to put this project out as a concession. So in terms of again, further on the assessment, the project is expected to be fully funded through HR TAC and other public sources. And so HR TAC they are currently looking to go out to sell debt. And they have built their financial model on their suite of projects that they have established to deliver this and other projects. We fully expect that this project will be one where HR TAC will approach the Commonwealth Transportation Board the next round of Smart Scale for Smart Scale funds, which could be a component of this project, but again, in terms of it still will largely be funded by HR TAC revenues. They and we are also looking at the TIFIA loan program as a way of supporting the project. And then finally, and what I'll talk about at the end in terms of this broader express lanes network, in terms of funding streams that may be available for this and or other projects in the Hampton Roads region. So this is where we have landed in terms of why design build, not design build, finance, operate, maintain. We've already talked a little bit about and by the way, this position has been reinforced by a number of what I'll call typical concessionaires. We had meetings with a number of them and said, what do you think? Are we wrong? And I will tell you that consistently we heard from these concessionaires that, yeah, we don't see it either as a concession because of the lopsidedness of the public contribution versus the revenue generation off the project. And so that, a private entity, they've got to have a return on their investment, and the return was just so small compared with what was going to be required up front. So again, I've talked a little bit about this chart, and really what this is giving you a sense of the design, build, finance, operate, maintain versus the design, build, and you can see the public contribution kind of at the bottom. It really just goes to say it's clear that DBFOM is not a winner on this, and that design build is a preferred method. So in terms of the public sector analysis, which is required, the design build is the public sector option here because it's funded entirely through public funds. And again, you can see as I mentioned before, it's a combination of HR TAC, both revenue bonds and pay-as-you-go, potentially TIFIA, and potentially smart scale funds would be used to support the project. The design build, it continues to preserve the opportunity and flexibility regarding O&M on the project with the regional express network, and again, I'm going to jump to that at the end. The DBFOM, it just is not the optimal delivery model. As I said, when you're putting 90% public funds in and only 10% equity or private funds, it's way out of balance. So again, we continue to preserve that opportunity under the design build to leverage this as part of a broader network at a later date, and again, I'll go into that. Why a design build under PPTA?
Commissioner, one second, just before he moves on to kind of why the design build under PPTA, are there any questions about the public sector analysis that he just walked through?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Powell?
Mr. Commissioner, does your estimated construction cost sort of cover the full gamut of both the board and the cut and cover?
So we're estimating that in terms of the project, between depending on the total scope of the project, and we have a large contingency built into our budget now. We're saying in the range between 3.6 and about $4.0 billion. In terms of HR TAC, they have not, so we've got, at this point in the process, we've got a very large contingency built into our budget. We also have not accounted for, in the sources of funding, smart scale and possibly some advantages of a broader tolling network, and also some advantages of TIFIA loans. So those are, at this point in the process, we don't have, I'll call it all of that resolved. We are comfortable that we can deliver the base project, and frankly, the base project plus a 4-lane tunnel for what's out there in the world. But what we are trying to do is to get to what I'd call the preferred solution for the project, and to be able to move forward in a way that a combination of the competition that we expect and the innovation as we go through this process, that we will be able to get down to, frankly, a tighter number and be able to deliver some or likely all of the scope. You could say, well, why don't you wait until you have all the money sorted out and everything figured out and it's a tight package and done? The value of money on a project of this scale, you just start thinking about the time value of money and months or years as you push things out to make sure everything is in a package where you want it. You're adding tens of millions of dollars to the cost of the project just in terms of time delay and inflation. Back to my point that we're confident that there's sufficient funds to deliver the original scope. What we really want to do, and I think that in talking with the region, there's strong support for, again, this what I'd call this preferred option, which stays within the right-of-way, but really gets us 2+2 all the way through. 2 general purpose and 2 express lanes all the way through. So that, in addition to work on the existing westbound tunnel, because we think that's an important component, because if you can eliminate the overheight truck issue in the westbound tunnel, you dramatically increase the throughput, because every time an overheight shows up, you have to stop all traffic. When we widen to an 8-lane facility, we now have added a logistical component, because I've got to get that truck, I've got to get it out of the flow onto the island, and so it just begins to really complicate things, because the future condition will likely be both the east and westbound tubes will be pointing westbound. So now I've got a truck trapped on the island that's too tall, and I don't have a way to get that truck off the island. So that's kind of the logistical components that we're working on.
And Mr. Powell would say that what we have seen in other places is that board and submersed have come in similar price ranges. Sometimes one's above and sometimes one is lower. So I think we are confident that both can fit within this general price framework. Again, I think what the commissioner's really noting on there with his last comments is they're hoping that with competition, they can actually drive things lower enough to potentially add some additional component to that project within this price envelope. And that's really gets to, I think, your next slide, Commissioner, about the, why doing the design build under the PPTA.
It does. So the design build is, again, under the public sector option. Went the wrong way, didn't I?
There you go.
There we go. There we go. So the authority to pursue procurement for design build is available both under the PPTA and the Virginia Public Procurement Act. We have done design build now for a dozen years almost, and we are a national leader in the delivery of design build projects. We win national awards routinely. We just awarded the largest design build in the history of Virginia in terms of highway work with the high-rise bridge at right around $400 million. So we have a very well-established process for design build, and the Procurement Act allows us to do that. The fundamental difference with this project is we really are telling these teams, go from here to here. You got to get under the water. You can't go over, but you have to go under. How you get under is your decision. It has to have certain durability and leakage prevention and all of the safety features, the fans, the fire protection, all the things we want. But whether you go with a immersed tube tunnel or you go with an immersed tube, again, very fundamentally is what we have today. You dig a trench, you float these sections out, you submerge them into place, you lock them together, you cover them with ballast to hold them down, and you have a tunnel. All of the Hampton Roads tunnels to date are done that way. The technology did not exist until the last decade, really, in terms of a large diameter directional boring. The Holland and the Lincoln Tunnel are going under in New York are both fundamentally hand dug. They were dug through rock underneath the river in New York City. They were not submerged tube, but again, they were old style, mined like you do a mountain tunnel. So with the technology today in terms of a bored tunnel, that technology exists and has been practiced both on land and underwater in the United States. One of the more recent underwater tunnels was at the Port of Miami. Port of Miami Tunnel provides access from Miami downtown down out to their ship terminal. And that was a bored tunnel that was built 2 lanes in each direction and was completed a few years ago.
Charlie, one of the, when you're talking about immersed and bored, and I know we still have to work this issue with the Navy, but immersed is going to probably have some interruption into the channel. Can that be managed, or does that bring a more value proposition to a board to alleviate that potential conflict?
There's and part of the advantage to allowing both methodologies is some of this will be the innovation that those teams bring. As you'd mentioned, that when you have an immersed tunnel, you have a dredging operation that goes out and dredges a trench across the channel, and then you come in after that and you place the sections, and then you cover the sections. So there's a number of times when the equipment is in the channel. The tunnels, of course, were all built that way, but they were also built, the 2 Hampton Roads tunnels, the first one was in the 50s and the second one was late 60s, early 70s, so it wasn't as busy back then, I guess is a good way of putting it. So there are those challenges, Mr. Malbin. Can they be managed? We think absolutely, but it takes, it limits operations if you're doing it in a submerged tunnel. And that responsibility and that risk and that, because you ultimately have to get permits from the Coast Guard to be out there and doing this work. And so the Coast Guard, what they will do is restrict how much of the channel you can impact, when you can impact, how long, those types of things. And that's going to all be built into if you're a contractor that wants to do a immersed tube or submerged tube tunnel, you're going to have to factor that in.
Well, and Commissioner, that's something that the private sector would be responding to in the RFQs. Most likely, I would imagine that will be coming back to this kind of committee to talk to us. So I think we'll have more details probably on that in the spring or whatever the schedule says, and when we'll be coming back, because that is going to be a challenge that they're going to have to prove that they can overcome to be able to move forward.
It might be a good opportunity for me to talk to in the second bullet about really the 2 fundamental tunneling techniques. hand dug or hard rock tunneling doesn't exist here in Hampton Roads. You don't, the material underneath Hampton Roads, you don't have rock for significant depths. Bedrock is hundreds of feet underneath the floor. So we're in New York City, the bottom of the channel is in fact rock. In Hampton Roads, we've got sand and silt and clay for some significant distance. But these two tunneling techniques each bring their own challenges. Immersed tube, as you've mentioned, are impacts to the channel and restrictions, and how do I do that with my Coast Guard restrictions? A submersed tunnel or a bored tunnel has to go deeper, and it has to go deeper because again, you've got to get far enough under the existing seabed that you don't have you've got a stable platform to drill through. And I won't go into the details of they can do all kinds of amazing things when they're doing this boring, including freezing and hardening the soil in front of it as they go. There's all kinds of techniques that are used throughout the world to do that.
And Commissioner, I think the Commissioner's hit on one of the key points on why we're asking to do this design build under the PPTA. Under a typical design build, we would get to 30% plans, even with the alternative technical concepts that are now allowed under the Procurement Act. The 30% plans for a submersed tunnel, or immersed, excuse me, I've been saying it incorrectly, but I don't build tunnels, so we don't need to worry about that. The one that you sink underwater and then cover, versus the one you dig in a hole under the, the dirt there, the 30% plans are drastically different. And that is why we're asking to do this project under the PPTA fundamentally when there's no financing risk transfer involved. So, the new law requires us to go through this financing risk transfer that the Commissioner walked through, and Mr. Powell, you and I were talking about with him earlier. But ultimately, the reason we are asking to stay under the PPTA for this project is the 30% plans are going to be drastically different, whether it's submersed or bored, because you're going to different depths, you're going to have different approaches. There's a whole host of things that are extremely different. And just to be as direct as I can, the Virginia Public Procurement Act does not contemplate that level of flexibility or divergence in plans in a single procurement, where the Public-Private Transportation Act does. And again, we want to have as many competitors as possible for this project. It's going to be one of the biggest construction projects we'll ever have in the Commonwealth. It's probably one of the last times we'll build a tunnel in Hampton Roads for a while. And so we just want to get as many bidders as we can into that, procurement to try and make sure we get the best possible value.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Powell.
To your point then, in the opinion of the Commissioner, is there a robust market of vendors that can compete using each of those methods?
Yes. Thanks for that question. Because I think that what we're seeing in the world of contractors that have the capability and the interest of this, you're looking at 5 or 6 companies that would likely pursue this. And of those, some number can do either. And they might change their team slightly they say, okay, if I'm going to need this subcontractor or this partner if I'm doing a board versus a submersed tube. But we believe that in the range of 5 to 6 companies, and we may see some, there are some companies in the Far East that do this kind of work too, that to date we have not seen them. They may show up also. But in terms of the two methodologies, yes, we see good competition in either submersed tube or board. By the way, they don't like when you use the word submersed. They like to use the word immerse, and you're not supposed to say you sink the tunnel section. You place the tunnel section. So anyway, it goes in the bottom at the end. But yes, we see great competition here. You're talking about the very best engineering and construction companies in the world, ones that have the financial backing and the structure and the experience to do this kind of thing. Now,
actually grow grow the competition beyond one or two potential bidders, and we really don't want to have one. We ideally like three, and as much as maybe four bidders if we get good responses to the request for qualifications.
Just quick. Is there a time difference in each technology? I mean, is the boring move along quicker? So do you shorten the project?
No, and I think that what we would, again, it's so, an example, you could set up, if time was a concern of a contractor, they might set up two boring machines, one going one way and one going the other, and have two separate tubes. They might have one single tube, 2 over 2. If you're a immersed tube contractor, you might do a single 4-cell or 4-lane tunnel with 2 cells, or you might do 2 independently. There's all these kinds of combinations, and that's why we did not want to be prescriptive here in terms of, we want to be prescriptive in things like you have to design it for 100+ years. You have to have this type of fire protection. It has to be this number of lanes, this wide. It has to be a maximum of grade, because we already know that coming in and out of the tunnel is a problem. So don't come in and put a steep grade to shorten your tunnel. Don't do that, because that's not acceptable to us. So those are all the kinds of baseline things we've done. But then in terms of, okay, is it 2 tunnels with an access way in between, which is what was done in the board scenario at Port of Miami. They actually drilled a tunnel one direction, turned around, came back the other, and then they, I'll call it, hand-built the fire connections in between. That's a possibility. Could you do it this way? The Alaska Viaduct in Washington State is 2 over 2. So the tube is this way. So there are all those kinds of things that we're looking forward to in this procurement process. They may on the 2 trestles, they say, well, God, how do I get my lanes in alignment? One may say, I'm going to remove this trestle. The other says, I might rebuild this trestle. So a lot of those kinds of things are part of this process. So the next bullet really talks, our design build program is I would argue is the best in the country in terms of design build programs for highway projects in the United States. Tested, it is a process that rarely sees a protest in the bidding process, and rarely sees an overrun in the construction, and rarely sees a claim during that process. It's a very, very solid process that we have developed. I'd have to throw it in the trash to do this project under that process, because of, again, back to the complexity of the project, the scale of it. We have bonding requirements that we build into our design build. The reality is the bonding and the insurance provisions for something like this are completely different than a traditional highway project. So I would just, for this one project, I would be taking this and throw it in the trash and creating a brand new design build process for this one project. The Secretary said earlier, and I'll reinforce it, I don't see us routinely using the Ppta, that provision of the code, that procurement vehicle, as a way of delivering design build projects. It's just not necessary. Our design build, the laws that exist in our process, takes 99.9% of those projects, and it works well. But I also don't think that you should take that and create a special process to try and shoehorn it into the design build under the VPPA, when the Ppta, I really believe, was envisioned and continues to allow for what I call more complex and more creative and more value, a better value proposition than we would be able to get under design build. So that.
And Commissioner, I would say the Ppta was created for this type of project. Just, I think it's either you have a whole set of rules that work for your typical projects, then you have some that are unique, special, and different, and require a different set of circumstances, and that's why we have this process in place. Similarly, we have this committee to make sure we don't overuse this process or put projects in here that can fit under kind of the traditional things. That's really what we're, at the end of this, we're going to be asking you all for your concurrence, that you're comfortable with the public sector analysis and that you concur that essentially the commissioner's assumptions as they develop that and their rationale for moving forward are appropriate. That's kind of the end point of the only action at today's meeting. And I think, the commissioners laid out a lot of those reasons here, but I do want to ask, because that's the action we have today, are there any other questions from the committee kind of on why we'd like to do this design build process under the PPTA? We have noted that it's unique. We don't anticipate to do a lot of that, but that's ultimately we're going to be asking for you all's action on today. And so I really do just want to kind of pause for a moment and say, members of the committee, do you have any other kind of questions on that issue before we kind of get to that stage of the meeting? Okay.
All right, I want to go to risk allocation. We would continue to have responsibility under the as a design build under the PPTA. We would continue to be responsible for operations and maintenance on both the existing and the newly constructed. Frankly, you don't want to have a facility that's, especially a complex facility like this, that's half maintained by somebody and half maintained by somebody else. You just don't want to do that. The logistical challenges are just, it makes no sense. Lifecycle management and revenue, and the revenue risk reward. Again, remember, what part of this is we are developing this as an express lane facility from 564 to Hampton Coliseum. So we would continue to get retain the revenue risk as well as the rewards of that. The private sector risk really is in terms of construction risk, construction delay, construction costs. This would be, as our design builds are, firm fixed price. And we will build in where we believe it's appropriate and to maintain balanced competition, looking at some moderate risk protection. But also to be mindful to not say, well, we're going to give it more protection for one type of construction than we would another. And that's sort of this, we hear routinely, if you want to do an immersed tube, they'll tell us all the things that we shouldn't protect for. If you're doing a bored tunnel, they'll tell us all the things they want. And so we have to work our way through that cloud and get to a balance point where the risk transfer is in the right place, I guess is a good way of putting it. Because transferring all the risk to the design builder just means they're going to add to their costs. They're going to have to build that into their costs, and so we have to maintain that balance. Okay. The sort of the next steps. Well, I'm here today, and I am briefing you today regarding this project. The finding of public interest, I will issue a finding of public interest that I will send to the Secretary for his concurrence. We expect to initiate the procurement with a request for qualifications later this month. We will come back to you in the spring with shortlisted teams. And what we really expect out of this is, again, I mentioned that you have 5 to 6 teams. You might have 8 proposals. Some propose one, some propose the other, some propose both. And we will work through that process to pare down to, we try to limit that to usually 3 shortlisted teams. And what we could have out of that, we could have all 3 board options as being shortlisted. We could have 2 and 1. We could have, it could be some combination of between a board contractor and a immersed tube contractors in that mix. So we found such value in maintaining competition throughout the process. We see incredible differences in how people attach risk and how they approach a project when you maintain competition. So that shortlisting would occur in the spring, and we would come back to this and brief the steering committee in the spring. After we do that, we would release the request for RFP. That would be the contract itself for them to bid on, and we would look at, it's 6 to 9 months to go through that bidding process, proprietary meetings, adjustments to the RFP, because we will learn things during that process where we'll need to make changes to the RFP to get us to a point where we're looking at an award in early 2019 on this project. And it's about a 5-year construction process to deliver this project. So that kind of gives you sort of a sense as we go forward what we're looking at. I mentioned Smart Scale. The next opportunity to submit projects for Smart Scale is beginning in this spring of 18 into the summer. We'll be scoring them, and by about this time next year, we'll be either have scores or
January.
the scores will be released in January, but we'll have a good sense on where this project lies. And I don't want to predict the future, but 66, of course, is under construction now, awarded, financial close. If I think around the state, so what's the next most challenging piece of roadway we have in Virginia past 66? It's probably this one. It's probably this spot. It's probably the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. If I looked around the state and said, what would your gut tell you? And my gut would tell me this is probably it. You've got some pieces on 95 that are of critical importance, and we're continuing to work on those up around Fredericksburg. So is there competition? The answer is absolutely. Is there something on 81? Sure. There's some things there that may come up. But again, I think that this probably will score well and be a project for the board to consider in the next round of Smart Scale.
Mr. Commissioner, I agree with everything you were saying. I think we're in a great position at this part of the process. You mentioned the name Dragados. That's the company that's doing the work at the Bay Bridge Tunnel. They're very familiar with this market, very engaged in this project, along with the MERS people that have done projects here, very engaged, and numerous other ones. So I think the interest level here is very good for the Commonwealth, particularly the two approaches to this project, which brings a level of competition that we're trying to get to, and I think it clearly exists with this approach. I mean, I would move that the committee concur with the public sector analysis completed by VDOT.
Well, Mr. Morales made a motion. Before we kind of consider that, are there any other questions from the committee before that motion is, considered? I think we would need a second as well at some point. Second. All right, well, we have a motion that was duly seconded, action by the committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Thank you. The committee has concurred, Commissioner, with your recommendations, and the public sector analysis was developed and the assumptions were reasonable and appropriate. Mr. Faraghian, there is a requirement under 33.2, 1803.2 that we notify the relevant committees in the General Assembly within 10 business days of the action of this committee, as well as the discussion at this meeting. So let's please make sure we get that over to the various committees at that time frame. I do know some of them are going to be in town next week. I'm not sure we'll be able to get it to them by that time, but I do anticipate that they will, want to see this before we get into session. I don't know exactly when 10 business days that clock runs out with the holidays, but I do think it would be good if we can get that over sooner rather than later. I also did want to note the commissioner talked about, Smart Scale being a funding option for this project. Some of you may be aware, I know it was in the media, we did apply for a federal infra grant as well for the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. And for those of you who are not familiar, the infra grant is a nationally discretionary competitive grant program run by the United States Department of Transportation. It is woefully underfunded, in my personal opinion. It has a grand total of $850 million available this year, of which only $825 million is available for award. We did receive $165 million the first year when this program was called the Fast Lane Program out of $800 million. So I am hopeful that we can compete well. We do think we've put together a compelling application that meets the requirements laid out in the Notice of Funding Opportunity that the U.S. Department of Transportation put out. We have heard that we should know whether or not we are successful by next spring. There is a 60-day congressional notification on those grant periods. So if we are tentatively made an award, which again is supposed to be next spring, we should be aware of that, though we may not yet have the funds in hand at that time. Again, it's a highly competitive process, so last year I believe there were $3 billion or $4 billion in requests for $800 million. We received the largest amount at over 20% of any state in the country, so that may help or hurt us, depending on how this current administration views our past success. But we are hopeful that we will be able to receive some funds there. So I think that concludes kind of the discussion on the actual construction of the bridge tunnel. But Commissioner, you have noted several times that there's something else you do want to talk about with the committee. And so could you go through these last two slides here?
Absolutely. And I know Kevin Page is here, the Executive Director of HR TAC. And the HR TAC fund, the HRTF, and that's the fund, and HR TAC, the organization, VDOT and that organization, we've been working over the last several years to really make remarkable progress in Hampton roads. We completed the widening of segment 1 of I-64, had the ribbon cutting a couple of weeks ago now, and we are under construction with segments 2, and segment 3 is now under contract. High-rise bridge is now under contract. And this project, again, working with HR TAC and the funding scenarios and how can we make this thing happen, we've really been making tremendous strides. I'll be briefing the HR TAC on Thursday on kind of this meeting today and where we are moving forward. And we're continuing to begin to fit all these pieces together to really leverage some great improvements in Hampton roads. So I want to talk a little bit about how do the pieces fit together. And some time back, we began to look at the opportunities for creating a broader express lane network in Hampton roads. And so I'm going to talk about the different colors and the different segments here and kind of the long-term vision. In about 45 days, segment 1, which is what's called the reversible lanes on 64. So today, from the 564 split at the naval base down to 264 is there's a reversible lane. It is westbound in the morning and eastbound in the evening. Yeah, I got that right. So very similar to the express lanes on 95, same concept. We have installed toll gantries, and we'll be converting that facility by the end of January to an express facility, which will allow, in the peak hours, which will allow HOV2 to continue to ride for free and single occupant vehicles to utilize that facility during the peak periods with a variable toll. Toll rates will be very different than in Northern Virginia. It's a very different congestion model, but there's significant capacity in those express lanes today is being underutilized because it's only allowed for HOV drivers. There is a transit component of that to improve some express bus service in the lanes that will be part of that project. So that project, segment 1, is actually going to be operational by the end of January. The yellow or gold color segment 2 incorporates the high-rise bridge project, which includes a high-rise bridge when completed will be 2 general purpose lanes in each direction and 1 express lane in each direction. Total of 6 lanes through that area. To the east of, physically to the east of the high-rise bridge, which is to the west if you're driving 64, there's a stretch of what we call diamond lane or express lane, kind of in the area from Greenbrier in Chesapeake back to 264. It's an express lane. It's a HOV lane now, diamond lane during peak periods. We're working to begin, when the high rise is completed, being able to convert that segment also to an express lane. If you're HOV, you would continue to ride for free. Others could use it for a toll, a variable congestion price toll. So that's another stretch of roadway that, again, frankly, has been underutilized. We've talked about segment 3, which is the project we just discussed. And then segment 4 runs from Hampton Coliseum out to Jefferson, which is the airport, and where the 64 narrows from 8 lanes today now to 6, but in the past to 4. That segment we really have not done a tremendous amount of evaluation on, but it is sort of the logical next step. So if all four of these segments were to become express lanes, which we think there's a great opportunity, from Bowers Hill in Suffolk all the way to Jefferson Boulevard in Newport News, could be a continuous express network. Separate from that, I-264 runs east and west and has HOV lanes on it now. That's a possibility for consideration in the future. But back to part of the reason why we didn't believe that segment 3 or the HRBT should be a standalone concession is why we think there could be an opportunity for either a public finance option or a revenue risk concession for this broader express lane network, which would include some construction, some ramps, some connection points and things like that, but not a ton of physical construction, but would be the integration of the entire network. So this really we see as an opportunity. If I go to the next slide,
Chris, if you go back for 1 second.
Yes.
So I just want to note for the committees, segments 1, 2, and 3 have been approved by the board and the TPO. Segment 4, VDOT is currently undertaking a study down there to make sure there are no adverse impacts on the general purpose lanes. This on 95 and other places where we've converted existing HOV lanes to hot, with the exception of the termini, we have not seen any adverse impacts. Again, with the widening and segment 1 open there, we don't believe you'll be dropping into a bottleneck. So I hope and anticipate that in the next few months we'll have some positive news there, and that was the commitment we made to the region regarding segment 4 before we ever move forward with it. But just as the commissioner noted, we believe the whole here is much greater than the sum of the parts. And, you know, we are both going to try and look at, you know, whether there's an opportunity to publicly leverage this or to privately leverage that. And that's, again, when those steps that Mr. Farrajon walked through earlier, if we were to move forward with that in the future, we would need to come back to you with that 9C analysis, with a, you know, higher degree of traffic and revenue study and other things of that nature to really show what we think this can contribute to the region for some additional transportation enhancements in that area. And so again, that's really kind of the key reason why, you know, beyond some of the financials the commissioner went through earlier, why we think it's not appropriate at this time to do a toll concession on the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, because we really do think that this network will be much more valuable together than separate, whether it's publicly or privately financed.
I had just one question. Do you have any estimate on the timing that we would monetize the network?
That's a great segue into the commissioner's, I think, final slide for the day.
Okay.
And I would say that this is tentative, what is here before you. We need to complete some studies. Those studies, depending on their outcomes, may lead to different paths. I think what we're showing you here is if everything comes out as anticipated or better than anticipated, this is generally the plan, but this plan is subject to change. And I think the first step he's going to go through really may dictate a lot of whether things change dramatically between now and this time next year. Commissioner?
What we're looking to do is put out what's called a request for information. And that's sort of a, put it out in the market and see who's interested, get some questions back from folks in the industry about, you know, what are questions to us and questions to them about what we're looking for and what they might be able to offer, questions about maintenance and operations of the assets. You know, if you're running a toll facility and you have this complex tunnel with the risk that goes with the tunnel, you might take a very different approach to the revenue stream than if your obligation was simply to operate the toll and the Commonwealth continue to maintain the, I'll call it the hard assets, not the tolling equipment, but the road deck and the tunnels and those kinds of things. So that's a piece of that. I think that we'll start to understand this is different than some of our other facilities. You've got directional lanes, reversible lane, directional lanes. So you've got this directional component right smack in the middle of the project, which they may come back with some ideas that we hadn't thought of in terms of, are there ways of making it bidirectional? Are there ways of doing other things in that in this segment? Are there ways of, as I mentioned earlier, the conversion of the shoulder to allow for, instead of 1 lane, 2 lanes? So those are all kind of things that we'll be hearing. In terms of when's the optimal time to monetize, that's part of internally what we're evaluating. We want to hear what the industry thinks. A couple of things that are going to happen. We're going to start to generate revenue and move people on the express lanes in about 45 days. So these folks that are interested in this are going to get a peek. They're not going to get the full picture, but they're going to get a peek at what revenue may be available as part of a broader tolling network. And so I think that piece of information is going to give some clarity to folks as they begin to develop it. I think that what you would really look for is a concession. What you want to happen is when the pieces get completed and begin to connect together, I think that one of two things: either the Commonwealth would continue to operate it and have a clear revenue stream and then monetize it, or you may say, look, I want to move more quickly and monetize it earlier, so that once the facilities, I'll call it open to traffic, you'd have your concessionaire in place at that point. But there's a decision point that we'll have to make and come before this committee, and that is fundamentally that if this express lane network comes together, which we believe that it will, should it be a concession under the PPTA, or should it be a publicly operated facility? And so that piece, that's a requirement for us to come to you and show, if we believe it should be a concession, why that's in the public interest. And the commissioner will have to make that determination and have it affirmed by both the secretary and this committee. So, Mr. Malbon, I think that the answer is I don't know. I mean, fundamentally, I think that we want to get out in the market and get some interest going and get some feelings there. My gut is that you would want to try and have, if you were going to do a concession, you would want to have it in place when these things open to traffic and as they start to come together, because there's going to be some construction, that's physical construction. You want to make sure all the parts fit together, and frankly, I don't like building things twice. So you'd want to as best you can to integrate that in the whole system in at one time.
And Mr. Malvin, just to add to what the commissioner said related to your question on timing, I think there's a few things to also consider. Is I think there are some distinct advantages to doing this in advance to the HRBT opening, because as the commissioner said, we don't want to rebuild the tolling infrastructure multiple times. And what we expect to hear from a lot of these folks when we put out the RFI is they're going to have some distinct opinions about where they believe gantries should be, the directional flows and other things which will impact where we might need to put gantries. And so we'd like to do that before the high-rise bridge tolling equipment is installed, and candidly before the Hampton Roads Bridge tunnel tolling equipment is installed. So really trying to make sure we put that infrastructure in the right place to allow for the best use by the public and the greatest value to the commuters is going to be very important there. And so that's why I think you're seeing us propose this now. The other option would be we could do this 4 to 5 years after the Hampton Roads Bridge tunnel has opened, and there's a proven track record of usage, which may either be a net positive or a net negative overall to the value, depending on whether or not people are using it in a manner similar to what we anticipated. I think the thing that the commissioner said about, we don't know for sure yet, we are hoping that we will attract a different type of investor to this type of offering than we do to the 66s, the 95s, the Elizabeth River tunnels. Those all involve substantial construction, which really meant you had to get a financing kind of person married to a construction person. Marriages are difficult, and we've seen some of those stresses in our P3 procurements. For this, because the construction would all be handled likely by us or our contractor, we're really could attract firms that, may simply just be investors. And so what we've seen in some other parts of the country and other areas is you see pension funds. CalPERS, the California pension system, is a notorious one that has invested in infrastructure throughout the United States, and I think even in some areas of Canada. And one of the reasons we're really interested to see if we can attract some of those types of investors to this is the rate of return that they look for is often, a third less sometimes, as much as 45% less than what some of the equity firms that go into these marriages with the construction companies look for. So instead of looking for a 13% return, they may look for an 8%. And that means that the amount of money they may be willing to pay, which then to be given to the Accountability Commission in Hampton Roads to invest in other projects, could be dramatically higher if we're able to attract one of those types of investors simply because they value the money differently.
So well, if you had the network in place, the revenue stream, though, could be leveraged by the region.
Correct.
And used build projects. So
in any instance, we would evaluate what we could publicly leverage off of this. Right, and again, okay. I think our premise in Virginia, and not every state does this, is you better be willing to take a risk that we can't and leverage, to a greater extent this revenue stream, which is what we saw in 66, where that concessioner essentially is putting their own money in at the risk that they will see higher toll collections, and we were able to convince the rating agencies would be realized. And so that's where they bring their equity in. And if they don't do that, and we can leverage more with a credit-worthy rating, we would have no intention, would not recommend to this committee to move forward with a, any private sector, concession opportunity here. They need to show that they are taking a risk that is worthy of the return that they're seeking to achieve. And if they don't, and they're not going to bring more money, or value to the Commonwealth and to importantly, the Hampton Roads region, then that's not something that we would want to bring forward back to this committee.
The reason I asked about the timing, and maybe this is a question for Mr. Lawson, but when we do select that time to monetize this network or not select that, what impacts would that have on our base financing? And I'm talking about TIFIA loans and our bond financing. Yeah. Does that have any, or is it, or no impact to that?
Well, I think to the Commissioner's point and to the Chairman's point earlier, I think the reason we want to go out now with this RFI is to get this industry feedback, because certainly the value of this network, the sooner it can be, I guess, kind of estimated, will allow us to figure out when it makes the most sense to plug it into the Hampton Roads model. I heard the Commissioner talking earlier, the monies could be used to support HRBT, but it also can be used to support additional projects that are part of the suite that HRTAC is looking to fund.
Well, that's my point, because it makes it easier if it's going to go to the suite of revenue to support the HRBT. But if our intent is for this cash flow to help generate ancillary projects around the corridor, does that have any challenges with the lenders to split that type of?
So, Mr. Albin, I don't think the lenders are going to be particularly concerned where we expend those funds, and we are certainly not going to entertain alternative facility charges or compensation events with regard to this revenue stream, because when we borrow publicly, we do not consider those things. So I just want to make it clear for anyone from Hampton Roads, that is not in the cards. You are not going to see anything like that. The other thing I want to make extremely clear, this money will stay in the region. We will be cooperating with the Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission as we look for ways to expend this. We may find it more advantageous to use this to reduce the amount of borrowing the commission does for the HRBT, or we may find it more advantageous to do other improvements on parallel facilities to 64 in this kind of corridor. I think the key thing we are trying to just do right now is ascertain and make sure that as we move forward with this concept, we get the greatest value for that region and the commuters down there. Ultimately, it's going to have to be a cooperative process as we look at what these funds may be expended on.
Mr. Chairman, to that end, I understand the reliable public financing seems to be coming from the HRTF stream of money in the primary analysis. They're going to contract with VDOT, who's going to contract with the DB, okay? And VDOT's going to operate the tolling network. And does that mean that you have a framework agreement in place with HRTAC now for use of those toll roads, or do you anticipate entering into one in the near future?
Mr. Powell, we would anticipate entering into one in the near future. We have not entered into that first. I think the first step that we need to do is have more advanced traffic and revenue to be able to understand the type of revenue stream we're looking at. But I'm openly stating, something that I think will be a fact, is that we were going to need to cooperate with the Hampton Roads TPO, the Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission. These funds can only be used in that region By law, the Commonwealth Transportation Board must program those funds. So 33.2309 deals with tolls on the interstate system, and that section of code does require that regardless of any agreements we may enter into, the final authority to program any such revenues rest with the Commonwealth Transportation Board. But I do not see any reason why the Commonwealth's behavior in this region would diverge from how we behaved in Northern Virginia, where we have worked in a collaborative and cooperative manner with regard to how to deal with some of the revenues that might come off of these toll facilities.
And to reinforce that point, in Northern Virginia, I-66, we received a concession payment at the beginning at financial close. We are developing and working towards an agreement between the Commonwealth of Virginia and NVTA that they will, for lack of a better term, suggest or nominate projects that the board would then take action on, and a combination of delivered by VDOT and by other entities. Very similarly, in Hampton Roads, the requirements for the Code of Virginia requirements for the toll revenue requires that toll revenue generated off these facilities be used to benefit the toll users of that facility. The detail, and so working, and HR TAC have been, since its creation, have been the entity that's been funding the improvements on this, when I said this facility. There have been state funds applied, and I use the term state, I mean state and federal, but the Commonwealth funds have been applied to these projects, but a tremendous amount of the value brought to these projects has been by HR TAC. A framework, and so the toll revenues, as Mr. Donahue said, by code, the toll revenues come to the Commonwealth Transportation Board, but the entity that is in best position to leverage and to deliver projects in Hampton Roads is HR TAC because of that relationship that we have. You know, what it looks like, some of it will depend on back to this RFI that goes out, and for us really to understand, okay, what, both internally us evaluating what kind of revenue do we think is going to be available and when, and what do we think the scenarios are for a concession, the timing of that money, could it build all that we want to build at HRBT? Or are we better off using that toll revenue on other projects that HR TAC has put forward? The next one in line after this is the second phase of the high-rise bridge. But there may be other things that as these components come together, HR TAC may say, you know, we want to do this, or we have something else along this corridor that we really think is an opportunity to further transportation. So in terms of that toll revenue, the agreement would be something worked out between the Commonwealth and the region.
And I think that's, you know, once we get the request for information responses, those will be made public after we review them. And I think once we have some of that information, we're obviously going to brief both the TPO and the Accountability Commission on the results of those. And I think that will likely spur a spirited discussion about what type of agreement and exactly how it should be structured. But I'm certain we'll be entering into one. I don't want to speculate on the form yet, but we will be cooperating with the region. It's the appropriate thing to do, and it's how we've treated the sister region in the northern part of the state, and we need to treat our regions in a similar fashion. Before we adjourn, I just want to see, are there any other questions from members of the committee? Again, we will be coming back to you on the minimum, the construction of the HRBT next spring. There is a potential that there could be some other projects, as the Secretary noted, that we may need to call these meetings for over the coming months. If we do so, we will endeavor to do our best to get materials out to you earlier than we did at this meeting, and just make you aware of those meetings as we are able to schedule them. I apologize, sometimes these things are fluid based on some of the bond markets and other things that just drive certain outcomes. That wasn't the case here. We just had some other issues. But I do appreciate the committees, you know, working with us, and I appreciate you all's time this morning. Commissioner, thank you. Mr. Farrajon, thank you. And with that, this meeting of the P3 Steering Committee is adjourned.